Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Michael Bossaque, and I'm your moderator for this evening. Thanks to everyone for joining us today in person, for braving tube delays, and those who perhaps have worked from home but didn't work from home today, and also those joining us online around the world. So this is the annual World Briefing Year Ahead panel. We did one last year. I've moderated some others previous years in different places around the world, including one or two behind closed doors, but we're always happy to open this discussion up because I think more and more these days there's so much going on in the world, it's sometimes very, very difficult to connect the geopolitical dots. What is something that happened perhaps in Beirut or in Taipei or perhaps even Vancouver, Canada, affect me here in the United Kingdom? And fortunately, we have some very qualified journalists and experts to help us figure everything out. A quick word about myself. I'm now an independent analyst since the outbreak of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, February, almost 2 years ago. I've been based in Odessa, CNN, and others. And previous to that, I was spokesperson for the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe and with UNICEF, and a journalist before that. One of the things we're going to be, that's going to kind of guide our discussion today is what I call we're 2024, which we're calling kind of the Super Bowl of elections this year. There's going to be elections this year in something like 70 countries, and in a lot of really, really big countries and democracies. We're talking about United States, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Mexico, South Africa. There's going to be an election, maybe we should put quotes around it, in places like Russia, and also in a very few short days in Taiwan. And what's very interesting right now is that the share of the global population able to vote is higher than ever before, almost 50%. And according to some trend trackers, we're heading into a very uncertain phase in the sense that, according to their counts, there are more autocracies than liberal democracies in the world right now. Not to put too much of dim clouds over what we're going to be talking about, but according to the World Bank, we have to admit they're not right all the time, but the global economy is headed for the worst half decade in 30 years with a global economic slowdown in 2024. And of course, as we all know, a lot of what happens economically is affected by what happens politically, geopolitically, for example, conflicts and climate change, migration. And what is happening also in the wider context, I think, playing out as an epic battle for global leadership between two powers representing diametrically opposed ideologies, the US and China. China being able to play the long game with an authoritarian iron fist using a carrot and stick approach, while the US, for better or for worse, is dictated by relatively short election cycles that defines democracies. One can say that perhaps one system is efficient but fragile, while the other is messy but resilient. Seeing choices everywhere, the world appears to be careening towards the kind of order that authoritarian regimes offer. And one last point on this before I introduce our esteemed panel is that one of the things I've been tracking, trying to connect the geopolitical dots, is it seems these days dictators, autocrats, thugs, non-state actors are watching each other and copying each other much more, and I'll be talking a little bit about that. So immediately to my right is Liz Sly. Liz is a journalist at large based in London, focusing on global affairs and the Middle East. Until January 1st, she was the Washington Post correspondent at large, covering global affairs, and prior to that, for 11 years, the Beirut bureau chief of the Washington Post. She spent most of her past 20 years in the Middle East covering the Iraq invasion, the Arab Spring, and ISIS. Previously, she had been based in China, Africa, South Asia, Europe, and the United States for the Chicago Tribune and the LA Times. And she began her career in the 1980s covering the civil war in Beirut for the Beirut Daily Star. Then next to her, we have Simon Willson, who has specialized in international news for the BBC for more than 30 years, becoming one of the organization's most experienced overseas bureau chiefs. He spent 6 years in the Middle East reporting on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Iraq War, and led the BBC team coverage in the 2006 conflict in Lebanon, which won an Emmy Award for Outstanding International News. In 2007, he played a key role in BBC's response to the kidnap of Gaza correspondent Alan Johnson, who's also a friend of mine. We met when we overlapped there.
Very good man.
A very good man indeed. And he was held for 4 months by jihadist groups before his release. And in 2008, after spending a year as a Nieman Journalism Fellow at Harvard, Simon was appointed as the BBC's Washington bureau chief and organized news coverage of 2 US presidential elections. Prior to returning to the UK in 2018, he spent 5 years in Brussels as editor of the BBC's European News Bureau, including coverage of the Brexit vote, how long ago that seems, and the major terror attacks in Paris and Brussels. Simon's most recent role with the BBC was as head of journalism at the World Service, overseeing more than 300 staff in 6 foreign language services, including both Russian and Ukrainian services during the current conflict. After leaving the BBC this past summer, Simon is now working as a freelance journalist, consultant, and strategic advisor. Last but not least, to our immediate right, also to the far right, is Ravi Mattu. Ravi is managing editor of Dealbook. He joined the New York Times in 2022 from the Financial Times, where he held a number of senior roles. He served as the paper's deputy Asian news editor based in Hong Kong, where he helped oversee coverage of the city's pro-democracy protests in 2019, the COVID pandemic, and the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. He also worked as the FT's technology, media, and telecom editor, acting editor of the Weekend magazine, and editor of the management section. Please welcome our panelists. Thank you very much. And we also had a bit of a switch. John Lee Anderson wasn't able to join us due to work commitments, so perhaps on the next panel we'll have him back. And of course, I'd like to also thank the Conduit Club for hosting us, and Pranvera as well. So let's start out, Liz, perhaps if we can, with you on what do you think, looking back at 2023, was the most undercovered or neglected story of that year?
Hello, and first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for coming out on this dismal night. I feel the most undercovered story in 2023 was Sudan. And please, if we have Sudan experts here, don't ask me to comment too deeply on Sudan. I am not a Sudan expert. I am guilty of undercovering it. I didn't actually report myself on that story, but at the beginning of the year, I felt it was going to be huge. You've got a major geopolitical battle going on there, and Russia expanding its way across Africa at the moment, and it's got a big footprint in Sudan. You've got the Gulf countries there, and it's an enormous humanitarian crisis. You've got the biggest number of displaced people in the world right now are in Sudan. That's 6 million people. Some of them are refugees in the neighboring countries. And my colleagues who cover migration are telling me that increasingly they're washing up on Britain's shores on the boats. And of course, that's what happens when you have unattended wars that people pay no attention to. Those problems come to us. And so, yeah, I would like to see more attention paid to the Sudan story.
Great, thank you very much. Simon?
So I'm going to be slightly cheeky and answer this in two ways if I can. I mean, this is a slightly off tangent, but I think as journalists it's good to be self-critical sometimes. And I think in 2023, although there was lots of really great journalism, even on the biggest stories, there were things that no one really got a handle on. So, for example, in the Russia-Ukraine war, what are the real losses on either side? I don't think we really know. What really happened with Wagner and Prigozhin? You know, how close did that actually come to sort of overthrowing Putin or even causing him a big problem? So I think there are some things there which we undercovered even on the biggest stories. I also think it's sometimes good to pause and think, even in the most terrible times, and these are pretty bad times, lots of good things do happen in the world. And there was one thing that was really good last year that went, I think, pretty underreported, even though it was reported, which was on the medical side. Some of you may know, and there may well be experts in the room, but 2 new vaccines, one brand new one against malaria, were authorized by the WHO and actually will probably save more, if not many more lives than stopping some of the wars going on. As many of you will know, malaria is one of the single biggest killers in the world. So there was some good news in 2023, and a malaria vaccine that's affordable and can be produced at scale was a really big one.
And also I have to say that that will make a big difference in terms of resource allocation for organizations like UNICEF. Spend a heck of a lot of time distributing bed nets, doing the training, that sort of thing to prevent malaria. So very important. Ravi.
Yes, and just to echo my colleagues, thank you very much for coming out this evening. Sudan is obviously a big one, I agree with Liz, but another couple, if I can do 2. One is Germany and its relationship with China in terms of understanding the geopolitical scenario. I don't think people fully understand how important China is to the German economy, which ultimately is the biggest economy in Europe, and a great prism through which to view the way Europe's relations work with China and indeed with the US. Why does this matter? I think if you look back to when the war in Ukraine started, Germany did a pretty good job of pivoting away from its reliance on Russian oil. It seemed to manage that reasonably well, although having to sacrifice lots of commitments around climate change goals. What it's now facing up to is the challenge of China. And it's hard to underestimate, or overestimate, just how important China is for German companies. China is the biggest car market in the world. German companies for decades have been spending heavily and becoming big brands and profiting mightily there. And now the Chinese car industry is exploding. Other companies in Germany are doubling down on their investments in China, while of course many in the West are pulling back. So I think that's a really interesting relationship to watch, to figure out what happens next, both in terms of reflecting on last year, but also thinking about 2024. And the second one, if I could cheekily add one, is the flow of Middle Eastern money. What I edit it's called Dealbook. It's all about the confluence of money and power. And one of the things that happened before Trump is when you'd be in New York or in the city of London and talk to people who are raising money, the first call they would make outside of these borders was to China. Of course, that's not possible now. Now the first call they make is to the Middle East. That means Saudi, the UAE, and Qatar. And if you look at the way they're investing in sports, if you look at the way investing in all sorts of efforts to diversify their economies, that interplay between money and power is going to be something that's going to become even more important going forward. It's not going away. And I depressingly, I think the murder of the journalist in Turkey by the Saudis has kind of been forgotten on Wall Street. So I think that's something we're going to be both reflecting on last year and watching a lot in the coming years.
Thank you for that. And not that we want to call it a decline in journalism, but it's been absolutely astounding, the number of closure of local newsrooms across the United States due to economic reasons, due to investment firms swooping in on companies, but also in places where there's conflict. For example, in Ukraine, hundreds of newsrooms have closed down because of the war, and it's going to have to be a factor in the rebuilding of Ukraine, is how to rehabilitate some of these entities. Just quickly before we go on to 2024, looking ahead, a couple, 2 or 3 choice headlines from the previous year. Thank you, Pretty Valley, for picking some out for me. But one of them was the Florida legislation required widespread removal of books from schools. Among them was Charlotte's Web, because it apparently included parts where natural animals can speak to each other like human beings. In Canada, something that continues to play out in my whole country, India was accused by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of assassinating a political opponent, leading to an unprecedented deterioration in that bilateral relationship. And in August, amid power outages and internet outages, the BRICS bloc of nations founded by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa admitted several new members, including Saudi Arabia and Iran. And around the same time, a headline in the Bangkok Post alleged that Russian gangs have formed taxi cartels in the resort island of Phuket, where scores of Russians have fled following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Thai authorities immediately denied this and said Russian tourists are not taking anyone's jobs. Something that will resonate here, industrial action was a big theme running through the whole of 2023, driven by disputes around pay and working conditions amid the rise of cost of living. Around 553,000 working days were lost due to strike action. We all remember in May the King Charles and Queen Camilla were crowned in front of the year's biggest TV audience of 18.8 million viewers. Also, we almost forgot about the COP28 climate conference started in November in Dubai. By the end of the conference, countries signed an agreement to transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems. However, smaller island nations left the summit displeased, saying there was a litany of loopholes in the final text, and the host country was reported to use the summit to lobby for oil and gas deals. Let's move on to the present. So on October 7th, Gaza-based militant group Hamas launched an unprecedented attack on Israel, and several hostages were taken. And Israel responded with severe force. Some of us have, previously been to the region. I went there in November, and one of the things, the sense you got from the Israeli side, for example, was that their sense of security has been totally shattered. The other thing I picked up, for example, was that all of the Israelis I spoke to didn't want Prime Minister Netanyahu in a day longer than necessary. Of course, those of us who have been to Gaza, we know the Strip very well, and I think the latest count of civilian deaths there is 23,000 or so, many of them women and children. Israel has been accused of war crimes there and is acting with impunity. So I wanted to use that to pivot to Liz. And Tony Blinken has just been in the Middle East, and it seems that he's being almost like a broken record, telling Israel to adhere to international human rights law, to curtail their use of force, to perhaps strike more strategically. But on the other hand, Israel has been using, according to New York Times reporting, bombs of up to 2,000 or 3,000 pounds in very densely populated areas. To give you in comparison, in Ukraine, not that we should compare these numbers very much, but the biggest, I think, strike there we have seen is from a 500-pound bomb. But Liz, I'm wondering if you could use your crystal ball to look into the future a bit. And I hate when people ask me this question, but can we see an ending here in this conflict? Because we get especially concerned when, for example, the Israeli ambassador to the UK says that, well, this two-state solution is out of the window. And we also hear right-wing elements in the Netanyahu war cabinet talk about the expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza. Where do you think things will go from here?
Yes, at the moment it's extremely hard to say how Gaza is going to end. It's not only the Israeli ambassador in London who's been making those comments about the two-state solution being dead. Several members of the Israeli government as well have made such comments. And in the most recent kind of comments that the Israelis have been making, they're talking about expelling the Palestinians to Congo. And they've been in discussion with African countries, including Congo was the named one. And then Congo's kind of next door to Rwanda, so you wonder where they're getting that idea from. But, you know, it's not within their capacity to expel Palestinians to Congo. I think they would love it if Egypt opened the border and they could all be tipped into the desert in Egypt. But the pressures on Sisi not to do that are absolutely enormous. And that's one thing the Americans are pushing not to do. Meanwhile, Gaza is being razed to rubble, and a huge percentage of the buildings have been destroyed. I've covered many wars, Mosul, the Syrian wars, the Syrian bombardments. I've been in Ukraine. I've seen nothing like the intensity of the bombardment on Gaza. We're talking a huge magnitude of order of more intense bombing and more intense destruction of infrastructure and property, in addition to the civilian lives. So the question is going to be whether there's anything left for the Palestinians to go to if and when the bombing stops. if and when Hamas is crushed. We've got no evidence at the moment that Hamas is being crushed, because every now and then you get these reports of these huge attacks on Israeli troops. So I think there was one a couple of days ago. So it's really, really hard to see where that ends. It's really hard to see how it ends, either with what the outcome that Israel would like, which is kind of to get rid of them all, or the outcome that the West would, or that Blinken would like and the Arab states would like, which is the two-state solution, because you do have to have a will for that. And I'm also going to be looking very carefully at whether this conflict spreads, which I think has huge potential. We can talk more about that a bit later, but the Israel-Lebanon border is hotting up as well. I got back from Beirut on Friday. People are very worried there. And although it looks like it's contained and it doesn't get that much coverage, both sides are inflicting enormous amounts of damage on the other side within the geographically contained area. And I think it's pretty clear that while Hezbollah and Iran don't want an escalation, because they've spelled that out and could not have been clearer in spelling it out, and the Americans don't want an escalation, I'm not so sure what the Israeli calculation on that would be as well. While they're on a war footing, they might well decide that it's better to go for broke now and get rid of all enemies on their borders. And we can see that they're not listening to the Americans on Gaza, so why should they listen to them on Lebanon?
And Liz, just a kind of side question, because you were recently there. I've watched a lot of reporting even before the war on PBS, the NewsHour, about how in tatters the Lebanese economy is. Any bright lights of hope there that you saw in terms of the economy turning around?
There's no bright lights in terms of the economy turning around. It has stabilized. It catapulted from a great heights to the depths of despair over the past couple of years. That's kind of corrected itself now. It's not descending anymore. It's stabilized at a level. People have adjusted to the complete lack of electricity by getting generators and sorting that out. The currency has stabilized at a much, much lower level, and it survives purely on remittances from abroad. There's almost no economy to speak of, but it's one of the big constraints on Hezbollah in terms of going to war with Israel in a much bigger way and or escalating any further, is that it just would not have the support of the Lebanese people, and I don't think it would even have the support of the Shiites for a full-on war with Israel.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Simon, before the conflict started between Israel and Hamas, there seemed to be a kind of rapprochement happening between Israel and some of the Middle Eastern countries. They were working towards a peace treaty with Saudi Arabia. However, when I was in Jordan recently, things seemed to be moving in the reverse. Jordan was the second country after Egypt to sign a peace treaty with Israel. And there has been a lot of angry protests there, as you might expect. People calling not only for the cancellation of a new deal between Israel and Jordan to trade solar power for water, but also even possibly to cancel that peace treaty. Where do you think things will go regionally for Israel?
I mean, I think that it's really important before one starts talking about the diplomacy, which I will shortly. I mean, just to acknowledge the massive human tragedy that this round of the conflict is. And I think that begins to lead you a little bit towards where it may go. There's no doubt that for Israelis, October the 7th felt an existential threat to the state, probably in a way they hadn't felt since 73. I don't know if you would agree. You two both know the region, but that's my sense, is that Israelis really felt this is now existential. And that has informed their response, which, as we see, as having terrible consequences on the Palestinians of Gaza. And they see it now in the context of 1948 and the Nakba and the expulsions. I mean, one of the interesting things, and I know from some conversations I've been having recently, that Western diplomats are trying to think towards a day after, is that after the big existential wars that Israel fought, and especially in 73, were the first seeds of the rapprochement that happened actually between Egypt and Israel, and actually Saudi involvement, because that was one of the things that led up to the oil crisis in the 70s. So there are, I think they're very background discussions at the moment, but they are about what kind of role the Saudis in particular might have in the future in Gaza. But as you said, whilst the killing goes on, I don't think there's going to be any real movement, and it's almost impossible to see how a two-state solution comes back onto the table. Yet at the same time, for most Western countries, that is the formal Middle East policy. So it's a complete logjam and a very depressing one.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ravi, you've got amazing experience in Asia, China. Also, we have to remember that China's also trying to play the role of kind of peace envoy in the Ukraine conflict, but also deepening their involvement in the Middle East. Just before I get to my main question for you about Taiwan and China, do you think they might be able to play a role here in bringing about some, if not calm, at least not more escalation?
I don't know how big a role they actually are going to play in the Middle East, really. The truth is their focus, they've got their own problems to deal with internally. And I think them getting dragged into these kind of situations is not something that really benefits them. I think the involvement might be more in terms of looking at how it affects U.S. decision-making and U.S. policy around the world vis-a-vis China. And that's probably the more pertinent issue for Beijing in terms of thinking about what role they might or might not play in that conflict. I think Ukraine, there was a bigger trade relationship historically with Ukraine. And obviously, in terms of kind of finding an alliance of interest with Moscow seems to have been, much more germane for them.
And then how much of what happens do you think in the Israel-Gaza war, as well as what's happening in Ukraine, and I'm talking about the reaction of the United States, will that have an impact in terms of when President Xi Jinping decides to move on Taiwan? Because a lot of, not only my thinking, but of others, is that dictators seem to detect a bit of weakness. They smell blood when they see this of the United States, in the United States and its foreign relations, the way it acts as security guarantor. Right now, for example, we have 60 or so billion tied up in the United States that's supposed to go to Ukraine, and it doesn't look like that's going to pass anytime soon. So do you think Beijing might sense a bit of weakness on the U.S. side and use that as a kind of reason to move sooner rather than later?
My sense on Taiwan is that maybe the calls for war, the urgency around that has abated somewhat. You'll have seen recently Xi Jinping is conducting a pretty big purge of senior military officials, which suggests he doesn't think the military is even ready to conduct a full-scale invasion of Taiwan. And even if it did, Taiwan's a very hard island to take over and to conquer geographically as much as anything else. And alongside the support for Ukraine, I thought it was interesting that the Biden administration included in some of its most recent bills requirements for funding for Ukraine, for Israel, but also for Taiwan. So its commitment seems pretty marked. And just this week, the FT reported that Biden was going to send a delegation of senior officials to visit Taiwan, whatever happens after the election this weekend. So I think to some extent, it's probably abated somewhat. I think thinking a bit more medium to longer term, though, there are pretty important implications. And I think it's important for all of us to think, obviously we're thinking about 2024, but the longer term ramifications of what's happening now are something to think about very, very carefully. I mean, I'd love to hear Liz's thoughts, but not only are we seeing the current destruction of Gaza, but that creates long-term resentment, which is going to possibly breed a whole nother group of people who are very, very anti-Israel, that be a generation of kids who will be adults soon. In the case of China, I think it looks at this in terms of its own interests. And you have to think about China less about adopting a values-based set of alliances in the way the US and indeed the UK and Europe would do. It sees a US that's probably distracted and quite stretched. It sees a US that's reverted really to historic alliances ultimately, when push came to shove, it backed, in their view, I'm not saying this is my view, it backed a historic ally in Israel, and that was paramount. So even despite after October 7th, the horror of that, the destruction that's been caused, support for Israel is sacrosanct, and that's been maintained. So for China, there's an opportunity in that. And the opportunity seems to be this, really trying to rebuild a multipolar world, which they view might be more beneficial to it. So you'll have seen the reinvigoration of this group called the BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, historically a kind of non-Western but industrialized countries that were forming alliances. That's expanded recently. China sees an opportunity to tap into the global south and establish relationships based on shared interests, and that's the way they view it. For countries that feel they've been neglected for many, many years, frankly, by the US and the West, and feel this is a demonstration of an adherence to old allegiances. And so it's very interesting to think about the way China is going to approach that. They feel very contained by the US. They feel that under Biden, the policies, particularly around the export controls around high technology, such as chips and artificial intelligence, are extremely punishing for them as a country. And it's a historic wrong for them. It fits into this narrative that for years we were a great power that the West has suppressed. And for Britain, that goes back to the Opium War. When I moved to Hong Kong, I was surprised how often this idea came up about the British essentially screwing over the Chinese in order to assert their interests. And so tapping into those alliances, they feel is an opportunity, and there are relationships that can be built. For another example of this, I think, beyond China, if you look at India, India is having an incredible moment right now, as we all know. The state visit that Modi had to visit Biden in the White House. As you mentioned, though, there are a lot of problems. But if people are looking in the West for a regional bulwark to China, India seems to be it. If you're a business looking for an alternative to China, India is laying out the red carpet despite all the very many problems it has in terms of operating a business there. So I think what's interesting about India, though, is that they're saying, we're going to maintain relations with everyone we can. So they're buying all of Russia's oil at a very, very low cost to them, which is, of course, helping the Russian economy at a time when the rest of the world is trying to constrain it. So I think it's that question of multipolarity and seeing not just weakness, but distraction, and therefore an opportunity to start to build some alliances. The last thing I would say is all of this is colored by the really big news, which is the US election. And of course, there's a potential of there's two very old men running for election of the most powerful country in the world. And it's hard you can't stress enough how significant and consequential this election will be. And I think for countries like China, you might see a lot of emollient talk and biding their time, and ultimately they're waiting to see what happens. And the consequences of what happens whether Trump gets in or Biden will affect what happens really going forward. But for the time being, they might be a little bit quiet and waiting to see what pans out.
Yeah, and in diplomacy, you always have to read between the lines. Did Biden and Modi give each other a hug, or was it a fist bump? Or we don't remember.
I don't know, but I'm sure Biden can speak better Hindi than Donald Trump did when he went to India.
Can I just ask,
Simon, go.
I'm just really interested. We know that China and Russia watch American politics. From the Chinese side, are they trying to interfere, do you think? I mean, is there, hacking and disinformation going on or about to go on?
There is, so I don't know if it's going on just yet. There's this whole concept in China called the wolf warrior diplomacy, where they deploy these people to spread information in very aggressive terms on social media and technology platforms. And it's certainly the case that in Washington, they're much more aware and much more alive to this. So one of the things when the current administration came in is they created a unit within the CIA all about thinking about Chinese dis and misinformation. And there's a very interesting example of what happened. So the short answer is, I think probably yes, there will be some of that. The reality is there are two things that have happened which we need to think about when we come to that. So last year after the fires in Maui, everyone remembers these incredible wildfires that killed many people. And there's a curious incident of the Chinese starting to spread misinformation on social media, according to US intelligence agencies. There's a kind of facility on the island of Hawaii, which is like a laser weapons testing thing. And according to the security apparatus in Washington, the Chinese started spreading information suggesting that this was really what caused the fires. Now, from what I understand, it didn't have a huge resonance, but what the worry is that this is a repeat of the playbook from 2016, when the Russians, a year before the election, started just seeding ridiculous things, building a community of conspiracy theorists, so that when they needed to really spread something meaningful, it had an effect. The only proviso I'd add to that is, I think it's worth remembering that in the US election in particular, the most disinfo comes from the candidates, not from the tech. And so it's worth bearing in mind, just thinking about how consequential is that? I'm not sure in terms of the reality. Of course, it's going to affect the narrative and the conversation, but when you have someone like Trump or DeSantis saying the kind of things they do, that might be more dangerous than anything the Chinese or the Russians can offer.
Thanks for that. I want to work our way back this way. But Simon, since we're here in the United Kingdom, we have to say a few words and share a few thoughts about what's happening here internally, politically. I think it was Tony Blair who coined the phrase "Cool Britannia." And for those of us who were living in North America at the time, we thought, actually, Britain has so much to offer in terms of culture, in terms of trade, in terms of innovation. But it seems, some might say that things are going backwards here. There's a lot of internal domestic strife. When the UK exited Brexit, it seemed that the UK didn't cast that big of a shadow over the world, especially Europe. But what do you see as the UK's role in geopolitics henceforth with what's happening, especially domestically?
I mean, it's obviously much diminished, and I'll be interested to hear actually some of the questions later. I'm sure we'll get questions on kind of Britain's role. I mean, I have an interesting perspective as a Englishman who left and lived abroad for 22 years as a foreign journalist, and I come back and see my own country in some ways through the eyes of a foreign journalist, and it's hard to see Britain in any other way, and the kind of political system here, and frankly the Conservative Party at the moment, as one that's kind of in decline, and it's hard to imagine. It looks as though the election will be in the autumn. All the polls suggest that Conservatives will not do very well, and whether Labour gets a majority or there's a kind of hung parliament, who knows? But it feels very much like the kind of end of an era. I mean, a little bit like, I covered the end of Chancellor Kohl's era in Germany, and it felt a bit like Britain does now. There was a sort of inevitability about what was happening. The proviso that I would put out there for all of us to just remember is just how volatile the times are. And actually 8 months, there's the old saying, a week's a long time in British politics. 8 months or 10 months, however long it is a very long time. And if some of the other stuff that we're talking about today were to happen, China to move on Taiwan, one of the two candidates we think are going to run in the US election don't, or get ill, or worse, crazy things can happen, a full-blown Middle East war that might shift the politics here. And the thing about Britain, it is battered and bruised. It is still, one of the 5 big nuclear powers in the world with a seat on the Security Council. And when Britain does bring its influence to bear, and you've seen it on Ukraine, for example, it is important. It's significant. It's a big country. It can make big donations. It can bring kind of military hardware along with it. So there is a role for Britain, but I think this is going to be quite an introspective year.
Thank you. And who would have thought that the iconic British mailbox, the pillar box, could have been so sullied by the current scandal? Liz, before I want to talk a little bit about journalism as a profession and the threats to it, but also I'm wondering if you had any thoughts, having spent time in the United States, about if Trump gets back in, are we going to see a return to kind of his tantrum diplomacy, return to him being Mr. Disruptor-in-Chief, trying to bust up, for example, organizations like the World Health Organization and NATO, or will institutions that are already there kind of safeguard those relationships?
Well, well, that's a big crystal ball to look into. Trump won't take office until 2025 if he wins the election, and the brief tonight is 2024, so there's an excuse to shut that off. But if Trump wins, I just feel that it's very disastrous if Trump wins the election. I feel it will be America's last democratic election, perhaps for a while. There's no doubt about what he tried to do on January 6th. He tried to subvert and divert the American democratic process, and he failed, and the institutions are coming after him now. He said he'll go after those institutions. I think Trump's first month in office could be him going after those institutions. He won't let it wait till the election after that and the days after the election after that to try and halt any result he doesn't like. He said he'll go after the people who've gone after him. I think it really could be a disaster, and I think he would be much more inclined to go on the path he didn't quite take because the institutions were blocking him in his first term, such as pulling out of NATO with all the ramifications that involves. So yes, I do think it would be quite catastrophic for the world. And I also have a strong feeling it's not going to happen. And I have a strong feeling on, this is just feeling, it's not going to be Biden-Trump. I don't know why I think that.
Could I just one thing to that?
Sure.
I think it's a really important point. The context is quite important in the global space as well. And obviously now, I work for the Times, I spent a fair time in America. And one of the things that's quite interesting is, alongside that, I think the last time Trump was in power, so let's suppose he doesn't get into power. Last time, of course, the world kind of united in terms of Europe, let's say Europe, kind of united in opposition as the rational world to constrain a little bit Trump's worst impulses. Now, this time he says he's going to be unleashed, as you said. There is a theory that Trump's victory might help all of those politicians running for office as the anti-Trump or the less extreme examples. So, for instance, one of the big things I'm quite curious about and concerned about is the rise of the far right in Europe. And in Canada, my native Canada, as Michael's, you have a liberal prime minister. And one theory going around some of those leftist prime ministers, centrist prime ministers who are currently lagging in the polls is that a Trump victory would benefit them because it would give them a target that they could go in opposition to. Now, I think that's kind of a weird analysis, but it'd be curious to know if Trump got in and a bunch of far-right politicians got in, for instance, in France, a really big, important country, which is plausible, does that whole dynamic for what it means for global politics change in a way that it wouldn't have last time? I don't know.
I don't know. I would kind of see it the other way. I would see a Trump victory in America as emboldening right-wing groups. I think we might have seen a peak of transatlantic Western democratic unity with the coalition built in favor of Ukraine last year. I mean, the European countries were absolutely delighted with the American response and the absolute firm commitment of the Americans, which didn't quite translate into exactly the weapons Ukraine needed, but all the rhetoric was right. Everybody was on the same page. Europe didn't disintegrate. Now we're seeing that fragment, and I think a Trump victory in America would lead to increased fragmentation in other Western blocs as well.
I'm going to go for a third way, which is, but I mean, obviously, you're both speaking a lot of sense. I mean, my experience of covering places where populist politicians get elected is that actually it's a very kind of local experience to that country, and that so it's interesting. I mean, you know, a lot's been written about, you know, populism and, you know, is it different in each country where it happens? Are they linked? But you can see, for example, in Europe, I mean, you could put Britain in that and say Boris Johnson was a populist prime minister and Brexit was a populist response, and there's been a bit of a pushback against it. You can look a little bit at what's happened in Poland recently. There's been a pushback against sort of right-wing popular, but I suspect, sadly, to your theory, Ravi, is that you know, politics is always local, isn't it? And the pushback against populism, if there is one, probably comes locally rather than by looking at America. But I don't know. None of us know.
Okay, thank you. What I can say as a citizen of America's biggest trading partner, we're also a bit concerned about what might happen if Trump loses. And people saying this was a fake election. So strap yourselves in. Of course, I think there's one thing we'd agree on here on this panel is that in order to have a robust democracy, accountability, transparency, we need a strong media sector. But it just seems there are so many headwinds going against this profession right now, not only in terms of the threats on journalists, for example, in Gaza and Ukraine, 70 or so killed in Gaza, 60 or so in Ukraine now, but also I mentioned at the top about the cutbacks in funding, and also the way journalists are treated. For example, in Canada, we see it happen so often now where government ministers don't have press conferences anymore. They don't even have scrums. So it's very difficult to get information out of there. And one more quick thing, I think a lot of mini scandals that grow into big scandals could have been averted if there were smaller, for example, daily newspapers that work well funded. Liz, how do you look at things? I mean, are there, again, I'm using that term bright lights in terms of journalism, putting aside, for example, the threats that happen when they cover conflict, but do you see that there's a bright future for the career? There's an ability for young people to come in and take over the roles when we all retire. And then I'm going to go to Ravi about AI in journalism.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned AI because that tempers what I'm about to say, but I remain a journalist optimist. I think journalism is still robust. I think independent voices are still getting through. I worry very much about local journalism. You really have to wonder what was happening to the press with this post office scandal in the UK. I remember hearing that like 1,000 postmasters were stealing money around England, many years ago. Just thinking, surely they can't all be that crooked. And it seems everybody was just prepared to swallow that these sweet postmasters in cute little English villages where they know everybody in the community were all independently helping themselves to the funds. It just defies belief. And certainly in America, I worked in local journalism in America many years ago in Chicago. For the Chicago Tribune, which was a huge newspaper at the time. It was as big then as the Washington Post is now. And there was a very vibrant local journalism section, and they were always uncovering corruption. Now it's shrunk to a tiny level. And I think you can't separate the lack of local coverage and accountability coverage in the United States from the rise, for example, of Trump, where all kinds of lies, such as the local postmaster might be corrupt, or this is corrupt, or that is corrupt, when there isn't independent journalism uncovering that kind of thing. But on the international scene, I'm still a journalist optimist, partly because there are new outlets now. Some of the pathways to journalism have closed down, but there's a lot more online. There's opportunities for individuals to go online. That brings its own dangers, but it also means that I find people as eager to read newspapers as ever before, as eager to find out what journalists have to say, as eager for independent news as they ever were. And indeed, AI could change all of that. So I will hand over to Ravi.
Ravi, yeah, on that one, I think when I heard this report recently on the spectrum of what jobs are most threatened by AI, I think truck drivers were on the very, very safe side because AI doesn't do a good job, as we know so far, in terms of driving vehicles. Where on the other spectrum, journalism was on the very threatening end of the spectrum. But do you think a lot of people here are concerned about AI and what it's going to do to their jobs? Is it really hysteria, or is there concern?
Yeah, so AI is obviously a huge transformational technology that will change everything, not just journalism. Like Liz, I'm frankly, there's a lot of depressing stuff out there, but I also feel like if you think of when search engines came through and Facebook and Google dominated all advertising, which they still do in terms of online, a lot of these organizations have learned to adapt, and it's been kind of amazing how they've done so. That doesn't mean there are some pretty fundamental problems. AI is obviously one that's becoming more interesting. Full disclosure, the New York Times has sued OpenAI over the practice of the large language model behind OpenAI, scraping lots of data from the internet. A lot of actors and writers have done this previously, but the New York Times is probably the first really big media organization to do. I'm not involved in that, so I don't know the ins and outs of it. By contrast, Axel Springer, a massive German publisher, the biggest, which owns Politico as well as Business Insider, as well as Die Welt and Bild, has done a deal with OpenAI to get paid millions of euros in order to let its content be used by the chatbot behind OpenAI. Will it threaten jobs? Inevitably, it will. I think there's a lot of questions about how it does what it does, and there's a lot of experimenting, which is kind of interesting, about how AI can be used to complement journalism. As an editor of long-standing, I sometimes think I'd like an AI to file on time, to file the word length I'd like, and with grammar and punctuation. But there are big questions, of course, going to be asked. I think what's interesting is where it can be deployed in ways that will be used to augment the journalism. So that might mean, let's say I'd written 5 stories about Manchester United's supposed bid by this guy called Jim Ratcliffe, Britain's richest man, to buy a stake in the company. It was going on for months. So let's say on story 13, if I was working at the BBC and Amateur Report every single time a rumor came out, on story 13, I didn't have to go rewrite 3 paragraphs of context about what had happened 5 times before. I could just say, ChatGPT, write to me what the context for this bid by Jim Ratcliffe is for Manchester United, the Glazer family, which has owned it. It gave me 4 or 5 paragraphs very quickly, and I could use that. So that's kind of a way where you can think, actually, it could be a useful tool to think about things. So I think there's some interesting experiments. I think it's very worrying and problematic in lots of ways. And I think it's going to be really one of the big questions going forward. Alongside the challenge of journalists, really is how do media organizations make money? That's kind of the big question. And fortunately, in the UK, we have the BBC as state-funded public broadcaster, which is in a different category of other media organizations.
Yeah, and we were talking a lot about all the elections happening this year. It seems that regulators have been way far behind the pace of technology development. But do you think, in recent months, perhaps, that jurisdictions have put in firewalls in order to prevent things like election meddling and spread of misinformation?
So this is a really interesting point. I think this is one of the things I was going to say for 2024. It's one of the big things I'm thinking about, and we all should be, is artificial intelligence and regulation of governments. And there's really a race on to figure this out. There are kind of 2 big things I think that are kind of instructive on this. The EU, which has often been very ahead on tech regulation, passed really the first big AI Act a few weeks ago. And it was seen as very progressive. They got lots of experts in very early on. The difficulty is that the process started in 2019. And of course, in 2022, ChatGPT was released, and that kind of exploded how we all think about artificial intelligence. It's the first time, really, most of us in the general public understood this as a pretty transformative thing. By contrast, in the US, they didn't do any regulation until quite recently President Biden issued an executive order. And it was, if not the longest in history, one of the longest. And that was really focused on what are the biggest risks. So in the US, their view is that you need to kind of find a way of finding regulation, not to prevent innovation and technological advances, but to find a way of giving some guardrails, as you had pointed. And their focus is really on 2 things: national security. So they're really worried about things like nuclear bombs being created using AI, and bioweaponry. So it seems that using an AI, you can do some things fairly easily that previously would have been the only thing that kind of states could do. And so that obviously is quite worrying. I think the third thing around disinfo is the whole notion around deepfake imagery and that being kind of put out there. Not an election example, but this is exactly the kind of thing that could happen in an election. Quite recently, something went out about Israel and Palestine vis-a-vis the Paris Olympics, saying that one of the countries wouldn't, Israel might not be able to participate because of the war or something around that. And it was all fake, but it went out there and it was already, and it led to the fact that, organizations had to respond to it. And so whether that kind of materializes in an election will be quite interesting. And certainly I think the election of Bangladesh most recently, but the Indian election in particular will be really interesting because the role of WhatsApp in spreading information is so much more powerful than news organizations is. And the ruling BJP has entire farms of workers who do this very effectively in terms of spreading information along their lines. And that goes so quickly through the ecosystem. So tech, AI are going to be really crucial. And I don't think anyone's really figured out the guardrails yet. But they're trying to keep pace, but it's a bit of a struggle.
Okay. Just quickly before I go to questions, so I want to leave time at the end for our esteemed panelists to look ahead to issues they'll be tracking in 2024. Quickly, Simon, any thoughts about future of journalism and AI there?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I'm very, very, very worried about the business. What encourages me, a bit like Liz, are the journalists themselves. You know, the incredible journalists I worked with in my last year at the BBC, in the Ukrainian service and the Russian service, you know, the incredible Gazan journalists, when almost all, if not all, Western journalists were out, who kept some sort of service going. I mean, that is kind of what gives me hope. And since I left the BBC, one of the things I do, I'm involved in various mentoring programs, and I always just draw great energy from the extraordinary young journalists who still want to have the careers we've had, despite the fact that no one's going to give them training. They're probably going to have to, you know, be an unpaid intern for 3 years before they get any sort of paid role. But the desire is still there. So that's what gives me a bit of hope.
Thank you. And we mustn't forget the important role of freelancers, especially, for example, I've opened my flat up in Odessa as a kind of safe house for freelancers. But you see up close the hoops they have to jump through to get accreditation, access, personal protection equipment, insurance. So let's open up the floor to questions, and I see one hand up already. Sir, you have the floor. Oh, there's one coming.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former law enforcement intelligence analyst who covered transnational crime in the ex-Soviet states, worked extensively in Ukraine, and my heavens, journalism can hold its head up high. The European Commission cannot. Quick question, because I've also worked in Yemen. Quick question divided into short term and the impact for the long term. If, or rather when, military action is taken against the Houthis, what do you think will be the consequences for that for the greater Middle East? And the second question, the long-term question, is what will the consequences be if there is no such military action? Because Egypt, Singapore, and China will be watching at a failure to protect the sea lanes.
Liz?
I think one of my sort of first predictions for 2024 is that we will see some military action against the Houthis in the coming days. The comments from Blinken and Grant Shapps have been like there will be a retaliation for this. It's hard to see what they can do without actually hitting Yemen, the Houthis in Yemen. And they will be probably strikes against missile storage sites or perhaps a command post. I don't think they'll go directly to assassinating key leaders. That's considered a bit of an escalation. I feel very strongly that Iran does not want this to escalate and that Iran will suck that up and that we'll see a little boost of activity on all the other fronts. One of the interesting things about what's going on is it all looks quite random, but there is a new policy that was kind of put in place about a year ago for this axis of resistance, which is basically the Houthis, the Iraq militias, Hezbollah, and Hamas, but Hamas hangs there a little awkwardly for complicated reasons. And they have been acting as a concerted front on their own respective, in their own respective like backyards. They've been doing what they can do. So Hezbollah can hit Israel, and it's achieving something from Hezbollah's perspective. It's taking the heat off Hamas because Israel has had to divert troops to the northern border, and it's asserting itself as an ally and the leader of this axis of resistance. The Iraq militias are doing their little thing. They're hitting the US bases. There's been 120 hits on US bases since October 7. And the US has really quite sucked that up. It hasn't done very much in response. The attacks on the shipping in the Red Sea are probably considered by the broader world community as the most serious aspect of this, because it does have such an impact on world trade. And I think that if we see US and British attacks on the Houthis in Yemen, we'll probably see an escalation of the attacks on the shipping in the Red Sea. And so that's definitely something to watch. But yeah, I don't see Iran directly getting involved. I see the others just escalating a little bit to show their sympathy and exercise this axis of resistance. A bigger worry for me is that one of these missiles that, or rockets that they fire at the US bases in Iraq will land in somebody's barracks and kill 10, 15, 20 US troops. Then you would have a clamor for retaliation or action or possibly even withdrawal. It would shove this straight into the middle of the US presidential campaign in a different way. And I would be a bit more worried about that, actually.
It's interesting to see how rogue states have bad technology when it comes to missiles. A Russian missile spent 3 minutes in Polish airspace the other day. It makes me wonder how the Chinese would have reacted if an enemy missile had spent that long in their airspace. Editorial comment there, sorry. Next question, please. Yeah, there's one coming.
Thank you so much. It's been a really interesting evening, and I have to keep reminding myself that I'm not behind my TV screen, that I'm actually in the room with you guys. I am Isabella. I am Brazilian American, so the trend of journalism is something that is very important to me with this context of both of my countries. And so, Liz, you've made some comments about localized news. And what came to mind is in an exponentially globalizing world where, ironically, we are getting hyper-curated news through social media, how do we go against the current? How do we fight against the current to become more localized and support these regional journalistic efforts? And just to link back to the idea of 2024, what steps would we need to take in the upcoming year in order to change that tide? Thank you.
My answer to that would be subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. There really isn't any other way. Journalism costs money. Everybody used to buy a newspaper. We all got used to this flurry of free news. You have to subscribe to local news organizations.
If I could add to that also, there are organizations, for example, Committee to Protect Journalists and others that are doing great work in terms of enabling journalism in places like conflict zones. So they are very important to support as well.
And the IWMF, I'll give a little plug.
Just one thought, Isabella. I think it's a great question, but it contains the seeds of its own sort of destruction within it, because you talk about, what should we do? The problem is there is no we. It's a very individual relationship, isn't it, with the journalism we follow. So there are millions of I's and not really a we. But I think Liz's answer, which is if all the I's subscribe, we will be doing something.
Thank you. Sophie.
Thank you. Hello, my name's Sophie de Schwartzberg-Gunther. I'm English-Polish, I should say. I was somewhat concerned to hear about Sweden talking to its population about arming up and preparing for what Russia might do. And I would love to hear your thoughts on Scandinavia and the NATO inclusion of those countries, and whether you think Russia really is going to expand its aggression.
I can have a stab at that. The fear I know is very real. Even before the invasion of Ukraine, I spent quite a lot of time in the Baltics, where there was extreme sort of worry on the NATO side that might be where Russia would express itself. My guess would be, and like all of us, we don't have a crystal ball. I would be quite surprised for Putin to move against a NATO country before the US election. That would be my answer on that. That would just be a really surprising move. He has surprised us before. but a bit like the Chinese, he's got himself in a position which is very distasteful to a lot of people and probably a lot of people in this room, but it's kind of playing out quite well for Putin in Ukraine at the moment, and a lot of the world's attention is on Israel-Gaza, and he's achieved a bit of a stalemate. And I think, there's quite a strong argument he'll sit and watch and maybe plan. I'd be surprised if he moved against a NATO country.
Likewise, I think it's another election which is happening is in mid-March in Russia. And of course, we know who the winner will be, but nonetheless, as I understand, Michael may have a better sense of this, is Putin still views these as kind of important for his legitimacy at home and abroad. And so until then, he might not do much. And then also, he too might be waiting to see what happens in Washington. I think there is a view that, if Biden's out, maybe they've won. I mean, maybe that changes the equation entirely for Russia. But even so, he's mobilizing a lot of people to have to kind of fight a current war, which, yes, it's going better, but nonetheless,
It's eating up a lot of
there are a lot of people from Siberia, and some of the costs, I think you're right, just getting to the forensic physical costs in terms of casualties, but also the kind of financial costs. Even though the economy has fared better than people had expected, I don't know how long that can carry on for with oil prices being quite low as well.
Yeah, and a couple of footnotes here. It was very widely noticed in Ukraine when President Zelensky was in Washington recently. There was a subtle change in language from President Biden. Instead of saying we're going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, we're going to support Ukraine for as long as we can. The other thing, as we speak, President Zelensky is in the Baltic states right now, and I think this is very telling as well, because he knows, and the Ukrainian people know, they have no better friend than their Baltic neighbors, because they very, very much feel that they could be next in line. And one more quick thing, because of losses on the Ukrainian side, President Zelensky and his cabinet and the military are looking at a possible mobilization in Ukraine of up to 500,000 men, and also lowering the age from 27 to 25. So, yeah, it looks pretty dire at the moment. We have one at the back there, please.
Hi. I'm an Iranian American who lives here. Complicated. But outside of that, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on Iran specifically, its influence within the Middle East, everything they do behind the curtain that potentially we don't talk about as much, and what future you see for Iran and the current government and everything that's going on there.
Liz, do you want to try?
Well,
Thank you.
yes, that's a slightly different question. And it seems that they've succeeded in crushing the revolution, but Iran has to look over. This is why I feel quite confident that Iran does not want a war and won't be the one that starts a bigger war. They have to look over their own shoulders too. We don't know where the Iranian people would stand on a wider war in the region, and they probably wouldn't want it. They certainly wouldn't want it or support it. On the other hand, a war in the region could bring the government down. The government seems quite comfortable at the moment. It seems to be, it's projecting its influence. It's got people at its beck and call. It's kind of put the Saudis and the Gulf countries in a corner. I think it's really significant that the Gulf countries have not joined the American coalition in the Red Sea, which they would have been expected to do a few years, just as even 3 or 4 years ago, they could have been expected to be contributing ships and participating. That's a sign that tells us that Iran's kind of got the Middle East where it wants it right now. So, but looking ahead, who knows how long this, I have no idea how long this religious regime is going to last. We can see the signs of the unpopularity and the dissatisfaction with all the incredibly brave protests that do erupt. But yet, time and time again, they seem to be able to crush them. And that's one of the sad things, I think, or the saddest things sort of my career is seeing so many brave people try and strike out for more rights in places where they're really, really squeezed for them. And it just gets crushed over and over again.
Can I just add a footnote? I'm sure you'll know this as a part Iranian living in the West. My real involvement with Iran is I managed the BBC Persian service for about 18 months, and just the level at which the regime was able to direct harassment, at threats at my staff, and again, you might know, but not everyone in the room may know, that they forced the closure of Iran International in Britain because of credible, the British intelligence believed the threats to kidnap or kill an Iranian journalist in London was so severe that they had to close an entire TV station here. So, I mean, none of us should be under any illusion of the lengths that the regime will go if threatened.
Also, another footnote, 2 days ago was the anniversary of the downing of PS-752 over Tehran, shot down by 2 Iranian missiles, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation is reporting that to this day, Iranian regime is still harassing the families in Canada to force them to settle for a deal. A lot of the young Iranians on that plane headed back to Canada via Kiev were some of the best and brightest young students going back to study. It's very, very sad. Yeah. You had your hand up first, sir. Yeah. Oh, okay, there we go. Sorry.
My name is Peter Humphrey. I'm a former foreign correspondent, 20 years, mostly with Reuters. I then spent 15 years as a fraud investigator in China, and finally 2 years as a prisoner of the Chinese regime. So I want to turn our thoughts back to China for a moment, because I think we've not covered that very much, but specifically to the Chinese domestic political scene. Because we follow Taiwan very closely now, what's happening in the Taiwan Strait, what's happened in the South China Sea, but I think one of the issues that's not covered well enough over the last year, let's say, has been what is happening internally within the Chinese leadership. And I think that what happens internally within the Chinese leadership this year will be quite important. In the 1970s and 80s, when I was first in China, I think the press corps and the diplomatic corps did a much better job looking at China rather like Kremlin watchers and finding out interesting things about what was going on below the surface between leaders and factions and so forth. And I think that's been lost. And I really think that that's something that we should see the media and the diplomatic corps paying a lot more attention to in detail over the coming year. Xi Jinping's rule has been a failure. His first 10 years, those 2 terms, were a failure. And the past 2 years, he's not done much better. His anti-corruption campaign has been a failure. His management of the military has been a failure, as we saw 6 months ago. His management of the COVID pandemic ended in chaos. His intervention as the person in charge of the economy has also led to disaster for the Chinese people. And so I think there are many things there going on from which we can conclude that his leadership has A, been a failure, and B, is severely weakened now. And I think we've entered a phase where it will be similar to people jostling for power towards the end of Mao's reign. We need to pay a lot of attention to the details and dig deeper. It's hard because, in the present environment in China, of course, information gathering has become much riskier.
If you could get to your question.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
the question
Very
is simply, what do you think about this? Are we undercovering the Chinese leadership? And what should we do about it?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Peter is a very knowledgeable hand, and I'd encourage you to read about his case when he was imprisoned in China, because it is very shocking indeed. I mean, yes, absolutely. But part of the reason is, frankly, it's very hard to get people into China, as you know, as well as being hard to cover anyways. It's increasingly hard to get visas for many journalists into the country, and so that kind of contributes to it. So, absolutely, the internal kind of machinery around all that and the purging of, ministers, executives, the list is pretty extensive, isn't it? And I think I would add to that the other piece that is something that we all should be watched very closely, and this goes a little bit also to the kind of what I alluded to earlier. China's got its own problems. The state of the economy is incredibly challenged right now. I mean, Peter, maybe I hope you can kind of give some sense of this, but the system relies on stability. That's what the Chinese want more than anything else, stability of the system. and that relies on having enough jobs for young, kind of angry people to have, enough income for them. And increasingly, that formula or that trade-off that's existed for many years since the opening of the economy is under strain. They have a demographic crisis. There's one of the biggest sectors of the economy, which is property, is suffering massively. And to give you a sense of that, some of the stats are extraordinary. I'll give you one number, how many empty flats there are in China. Something like enough to house 3 billion people. Because what happens is these are built, and traditionally they were sold now, and they're kind of a boondoggle. There's a whole kind of long story, which Peter will know better than me, about how these were used essentially to kind of flush money through systems. But if that's not working, they don't have enough people now, and they're really struggling to keep the economy going. Yeah, there's a lot of big challenges, so absolutely. But it is, as you point out very clearly, very difficult indeed. Yeah, and actually, if I would, I mean, what happens in China matters for all of us. I know there's all this talk of decoupling, and now it's de-risking, but for whatever we say, I mean, the interlocking of the West economically to China is much more closely intertwined than it was certainly in the days of the Cold War when the Soviet Union was kind of separated. So the consequences of that are super severe, absolutely.
Yep, I just wanted to add something like, take the Washington Post, the newspaper I just left. We had a robust bureau in Beijing. The 3 journalists there were kicked out during the pandemic. We have not been able to get anyone back in since then. So the Washington Post, which now has a big global footprint, it was always a Washington paper, but now it's a big global newspaper that's, that is accessible all around the world. We don't have a presence in China. And there was also a very interesting story a couple of weeks ago on the front page of the Wall Street Journal about how the CIA also has no idea what's going on in China. And all the questions you're asking, which government official is in with which, and what are the machinations behind the scenes, it boldly states that the CIA officials say, we have no idea. Their networks were rolled up. They haven't been able to get people back in.
1 second. We haven't had a chance to talk much about Hong Kong. You and I were there when the protests were happening, but because of that national security law promulgated by Beijing forced on Hong Kong, it's so broadly worded you can drive a truck through it. But even people like me who've written a few pieces for CNN Opinion about Xi Jinping in Hong Kong are a bit afraid to go to Hong Kong right now. It's that bad. And there are not many places I'm afraid to go to, but that's the state of reality right now. So you had a question?
I just wondered about journalism's opinion in general. What seems to be the quality, in terms of the drop in quality of the lack of politicians. So what I mean by that, and just leader in general, I think probably one of the reasons why we've started to see a rise in populism or whatever else, or the same individuals that we've always seen, is that the actual quality of politician, more so not necessarily from their political standpoint or academia, but their actual charisma, doesn't seem to be there. Definitely in regards to sort of the last 10 to 15 years, which is why you might see, you made that comment about kind of 2 old men. You've got one who, from a charismatic point of view, whether you like his opinions or not, he's someone who's been on our TVs for over 30 years. He's been in movies, he's been in media, he knows how to speak. And then the other person, also 75, but from a political context, he appears to be a safe member of hands. He was in the last, two regimes, but before, he's someone that we've always seen. And I think there is a role that journalism can potentially play in regards to, I don't think we see it enough, where you need to be a bit more critical about the quality of some of these politicians. So back to the UK, I don't think we've ever had a time whereby we would even be questioning if the current opposition would be getting in based on what the standing government has been doing for sort of the last 2 or 3 years. And as opposed to just focusing on the standing government, there should probably be more question of why we are questioning whether the Labour government will get in. And of course, that's about the leadership, that's about the quality of politician, and therefore it's about the succession planning as well. Because if you don't do the succession planning appropriately and actually be more critical on that, we will keep seeing these same people over and over again. So I'd love to get your opinion on why we don't see more of that and what role you think you can play.
Thank you. If I can offer it, I mean, I would go against actually the premise of your question a little bit. So it's the same way, the answer to the earlier question about the kind of journalism you want to do. So first of all, choose quality journalism and pay for it. But even if you see things online that are free, don't just choose some random YouTube video you don't know where it's come from. Check the veracity of it. Similarly, for the politicians, I mean, that may be the case, but there is an old adage that populations get the politicians they deserve, right? Countries live in democracies, and we should be thankful we live in a democracy where you can kind of still vote for people. Choose the politicians that you want in power, and that's going to lead to the quality thing. I guess the question, the corollary out of that, which the thing that kind of I find tricky to kind of totally understand, is what happens when people know that politicians and media are lying but don't really seem to care. And that's kind of that post-truth period or whatever we've got to. So that's the kind of bigger question. But I don't necessarily know. I mean, there's a lot of criticism of the Labour Party or the opposition, and there's a lot of criticism of Biden and Trump, and a lot of analysis of Biden doing some pretty consequential things as president, some incredible things for the economy, really serious industrial policy around trying to change the U.S. economy, which is super consequential, not just for the U.S., but for the rest of the world. So there's a lot of coverage, and I guess the question is, how do you sift through it and discern it?
Well, and also what I would say, what I sort of hear in your question, I think this is what you're getting at, but correct me if I'm wrong, but in a lot of Western democracies, there's a sense of kind of staleness and you know, a population that's ready for something new, but it's not coming yet. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there was a feeling. I'm sure Liz was there, kind of covering the Arab Spring and these Facebook revolutions, and it felt like maybe a new generation of leadership would emerge from that, but it didn't really, in the Arab world, for reasons that they were put down. But it hasn't really happened in the West either. I mean, arguably, possibly in France, I noticed there's a very young new prime minister there being appointed by Mr. Macron. But I think that's what you're reflecting is there is a real sense of staleness, and that's where the charismatic populists step in. I mean, interestingly, you had a discussion about journalism and politicians. I mean, I'm old enough. I worked in Brussels when Boris Johnson was the correspondent for the Telegraph, and he was a very charismatic journalist who went on to become a charismatic politician. But I think, it feels to me that a new generation of leadership will arise, and maybe up to some of you in this room to be sort of among that. It goes back to Isabella's question. It's a time to get up and do things.
Yeah, I would just add to, an interesting little anecdote. If you add the age of the new prime minister in France to the age of Macron, they are still younger than Biden. That was on the BBC.
And I heard after their appointment, they're putting in a squash court and a Tesla charging station in the Élysée Palace.
But I was also just going to say, I think the bigger danger I would much rather have an uncharismatic but reliable and safe and honest politician than I would some flashy personality. And I think the biggest danger that we face is the post-truth era. And one of the alarming things I see, especially in the US, but I've also noticed it here and with the BBC sometimes too much, is the both-sidism, that when one side is spewing lies and the other side is telling it, not spewing lies, maybe arguing their point of view, don't treat them equally. You have to call it out as lies. There was an absolutely appalling piece in the AP the other day that said both Trump and Biden are campaigning on the January 6th issue, but they're offering opposite points of view, as if each point of view was equally valid. One is one is a kind of treasonous attempt to overthrow the government, which is what Biden's saying. And Trump is portraying this as an anti-democratic movement to get rid of him, and that was a movement of democracy. You can't give equal weight when lies come along, and the media holds some responsibility for that. We have to adjust to the fact that our democracy are now flawed and dysfunctional, and work to kind of just maintain telling the truth, not allow lies to come into our coverage.
Last question to someone with a transatlantic perspective. Carol?
This will be very, very short, because I'm sure we're ready to wrap this up. You made a comment, Liz, about the issue we've all discussed of Israelis' failure to even anticipate what had happened. And we're hearing other stories that are underground, the same thing, of failures of the CIA, the FBI, and security services. Should we not be paying more attention to how this has happened, not just in Israel, but globally? How are we protecting the citizens of the world when our security investigators are falling down?
Well, in that sense, I think there's quite a lot of similarity between 9/11 and the October 7 attack, because 9/11 happened because the FBI and the CIA were asleep at the wheel. We know that there were some young CIA agents who got wind that some guys were going to try and fly airplanes into tall buildings, but 17 of them swanned into America and took flying lessons there and got onto the plane with the box cutters and things. That wouldn't happen now. The security response has protected us from major disasters involving aeroplanes ever since. We haven't had a major like ISIS terrorist attack in the West for quite some time now. Israel was asleep at the wheel. A lot of this is a security problem. This is why I feel there's a disconnect between what caused October 7 and the response to October 7, which is to kind of level an entire community and kill lots of people. It doesn't solve the ultimate problem. And it doesn't make Israel safer, because Israel should have been awake on that day. And I'm absolutely sure that that's not going to happen again, because they will correct those mistakes. And a lot of this terrorism thing is a policing problem with an attempt to make much longer-term solutions to the original and deep causes of the problem, but not to go around smashing and grabbing, which is what the Americans did after 9/11. And look where that got us, 20 years of war. And it probably made the problem worse for quite a lot of those years.
It's interesting, just to add one thing, there's an interesting thing that happened this week around that, to bring it to AI again. Because ultimately, we're all human, so that you're right, these intelligence failures. But,
sure?
But yeah, exactly. I know that I am. I'm feeling very old, I gotta say. And just like when you go to a GP, we all expect the GP to have a perfect answer for our ailment, but ultimately they're just kind of guessing and doing a bit of an assessment of, and on a law of probabilities, they're saying you've got X. This week, the NSA in the US revealed that they're using AI to preemptively check for hacks into critical American infrastructure. And they're claiming that they can use this to find the stuff out. So the proselytizers and the evangelists for AI would say that that's the solution. Less human, more tech.
Thank you. To spare myself from summing up such an incredibly complex topic, this is a great panel and great questions from the audience. Thank you. Do a quick lightning round about what are some of the issues or regions you're going to be paying particular attention to in 2024. Liz, would you like to?
Well, I kind of touched on them. I'd add Myanmar's looking very interesting. The rebels are actually doing quite well. They're taking territory. They've got Chinese backing. The junta could fall. India wouldn't like that. That's one small thing. And in general, the big elephant in the room is the American election, and we can't possibly predict what's going to happen. We don't even know who the candidates are going to be. But it's going to have an impact on the world as well, because one of the reasons why America will be really determined to stop escalation in the Middle East is that I really don't see how Biden could possibly go into an election with a big bloody war on his hands that's killing American soldiers. That might hand the election to Trump and upset my prediction on that. And the politicians in America are going to be distracted. It's going to be very inward looking for the next year at a time when enormous challenges are breaking out all over the world that might require American attention. So it's going to be a bit wobbly for the next year, I think.
Thank you.
Slightly different tack. I mean, one thing we haven't mentioned at all, I don't think, tonight, or only in passing, is climate change.
Yeah.
I mean, I am now mercifully, perhaps, freed from my burden of impartiality I had as a senior BBC manager, and I can now campaign on things I believe in. So I'm involved in a small group, and we are setting up an NGO which we hope is going to be the start of holding governments to account for their climate change policies. Because some of you may know there are several organizations which hold companies to account and get them to disclose their carbon footprints. And we believe, and we're not the only ones, other people are doing this as well, that the next step is holding governments to account. So I'm going to be spending a lot of 2024 trying to do that.
Thank you.
Climate change is a big one. I'm very curious about how many more wildfires there'll be this year from Canada. New York realized, because it got blanketed in smoke from Canada, that wildfires are a permanent thing now. The U.S. election, of course, but also China in relation to that, and particularly how long will the alliances last? Biden's been quite effective at establishing alliances in Europe and elsewhere, in South Korea and Japan, to kind of try to contain China. But increasingly, I wonder whether governments in places like Europe and South Korea and Japan will be frustrated with the sacrifices they're making in terms of constraining their big companies and their economies, and wondering what are we getting in return from the US for doing this? And particularly if Trump gets into power, what will happen with that?
Yeah, and one of the reasons I sold my place in what's called Lotus Land in Canada, Vancouver Island, is because of recurring smoke every year from wildfires coming from southern British Columbia and Washington State, Oregon. So I think we all know what we need to do. We need to go out and vote where we're eligible to vote. We need to support journalism in any way you can. And I think it's also worth saying to remind everyone that if you're an investor or you're looking at getting involved in a company or an NGO, have a look at their track records, but especially when it comes to the environment, their policies on the environment, that sort of thing. So in other words, do your due diligence. I think it's incumbent upon all of us, because I think the thing I pick up at panel after panel is a lot of people are understandably feeling very disempowered and they don't have influence, but you do. And another way, by the way, is to write into your newspapers and to write opinion pieces. It's not rocket science, and they welcome the contributions of ordinary people as well. Thank you very, very much to the panelists for their insight and intellectual thoughts, and thank you. Thank you again to Primavera, to Online Frontline, and some very interesting events coming up, so do check the website, Facebook page, and again, thank you to the Conduit Club, and thank you to you, the audience, both here in London and online. Have a good evening.